I don't know if you remember I think it was called In the Red Skies of Montana. There was a chap called Wagner Dodge. And anyway, and they made a film of it where he was a fireman and there were 15 they called stormtroopers.
Right.
And anyway, the fire was coming his way fast and he didn't have time. And he set fire to the ground around him so that it burned so that the main fire would go over him and form a shelter to some extent. Anyway, the long and short of it is that was a high pressure decision that required, instant thinking, off the cuff and out of the box thinking. So in those situations, he didn't have much time, but he had some time, and it wasn't long. You might have been on a couple of minutes in that scenario. So he didn't have too much time, but it is possible to do it. And the science says that if you'd use those 3 seconds, that it does make a difference. And there are other studies in hospitals that show the same, that the surgeons who don't just rush to their instinct based on however many years experience they have, that if they pause and then double check, that the accuracy level, it actually goes up by 30% rather than just rushing to judgment. But it is much harder now. But being hard doesn't mean it's impossible. It is a conscious step, and the consequences of not doing it are far more severe than the consequences of just slowing down a little. But that's not to say it's easy. It's possible. But I think, as you say, it starts with a conscious decision that actually you want to be more responsible. And if you do hold a position of power, it's unbelievably important, because the consequences, it's not just you and your reputation, it's the impact on other people. And we don't always think of that when we're in a hurry. We typically think of ourselves. But, if you look around you, it can be your family, your clients, your customers, your employees. All the decisions we make have consequences, and we're too busy to think about it and evidence the whole premise of the book, which is human error is rising, and it is. And people are feeling more and more unheard because we're so busy. We don't get the chance to firstly tune in and then reinterpret what people are saying. So it is a bit of a crisis. Not wishing to be negative, but it kind of is.
Yeah, no, I get that. I see that. I sense that. I think you're absolutely right. I do think there, in many respects, is a sort of attention crisis, a crisis around our ability to make good decisions and actually tune in to what matters, right? I agree. Yeah. In the book, Nuala, you mentioned 2 things that really piqued my interest, and it's the first one is a twist on a common used phrase, right? We all talk about blind spots, certainly in terms of leadership development. For years, people have been talking about what are your blind spots, but you've flipped that round, right? And they're talking about deaf spots. What do you mean by deaf spots, please?
You're absolutely right. I think most of us, get the idea of blind spots, the inability or unwillingness, if you like, to perceive a problem or a fact or whatever. But deaf spots are less known, but equally powerful. And I deliberately use deaf spots. Obviously, it tied in with being tuned out, but it has its roots in that we hear what we want, we mishear, and we don't hear what really matters. And it's rooted in science very clearly. There is a concept of deaf ear syndrome, which is exactly that. And there are quite a spate of biases that support it, whether it's, I'll give you the most obvious one, is the ostrich effect, where we literally put our heads in the sand and don't listen to people, whether it's about medical advice or, parental advice or feedback or whatever. And then I suppose you could use the romantic example where we hear what we want when we're told, and how many of us have fallen for those sweet lines over time. But then in business, there's another one that touches on that naivety that maybe I pointed to earlier, which is a default to truth. We automatically believe what we're told. We don't think bad things happen. And that mixes with something that's called the just world hypothesis, which is we believe that good people get rewarded. You work hard, you'll get your pay rise or your bonus or a promotion. And, bad people, the underperformers in a work context, or people on the battlefield in your case, get punished. So there is that view, and it is an incorrect view, because that's exactly what it says. We believe in a just world, and that can lead us astray as well, because I guess it means you're not really looking for hidden agendas and motivated reasoning and others. So that's another, and it is it is what you're listening. You're not reinterpreting what someone's telling you. You're just taking it at face value and moving on. And there are many examples of people who have done that and got it wrong. So that's why I wanted to focus on deaf spots. But I didn't want to ignore dumb spots, because they are blind, deaf and dumb spots. And dumb spots are very current because they relate to the inability or unwillingness to speak up. So you might self-silence, you might hear about a wrongdoing and decide that you're a bystander in that scenario, and many people do. But when you choose to self-silence, other people can't hear your voices. So by definition, it's a dumb spot because no one can hear whatever opinion you have. And of course, there's a degree of severity there as well. So all three actually have been form what I've called the trilogy of error, which is blind, deaf, and dumb spots. And it's about thinking in 3D. So again, it's just a quick way, because people might find, biases or blind spots or deaf spots too hard to grasp. But I think anyone can get a trilogy of error. Just try and think of all of those and see, are you at risk against them?
Yeah, and a link to that, what I wanted to ask you about, you also, in the book, when you're talking about deaf spots, mentioning this concept of unintentional deafness. But I wanted to ask you, what's your take on sort of intentional deafness? And what I mean by that is it's started to become really clear to me, like I was going to say over the past few years, but it's much longer than that, really. Having sat in kind of countless meetings when I worked in the corporate sector, and now sort of doing my work in terms of leadership and team development, I might kind of sit in and observe lots of meetings with clients or whatever. And I don't know whether this is intentional or unintentional sort of deafness, but I notice more and more that people choose to hear comments, data points, whatever you want to call it, that supports their position or their argument, and they choose to sort of block out all the stuff that doesn't. So like, is that intentional? Is that unintentional? Is that deliberate sort of selective listening? Like, what's your take on that? And are there any tips for overcoming it?
You've actually made two really good points there. Your point about that people choose to block out certain information in meetings to support their arguments is actually confirmation bias. And that is a, that's a blind spot or a deaf spot because they only hear what they want. A lot of people do that unconsciously. If I said to you, now, Ben, do you know that you're suffering from confirmation bias? You just go, huh? But if I asked you what your favorite sports team was and then gave you all these reasons as to why, they were great, you would only pick out the reasons that you agreed with. If I gave you a counter argument about why they were awful, of course you wouldn't hear a word of it. So that's confirmation bias. You only pick up what you want to hear. But your question about intentional deafness plays directly to a full chapter in the book, which is what I consider the ethical misjudgment traps. Because if you are intentionally doing that, and in a business situation, or indeed any situation, if you're a judge or whoever, you are actually sort of entering into that slippery slope. So, for example, intentional deafness is when, let's just say, the rogue traders. So the rogue traders, Nick Leeson or Jerome Curviel from SocGen, they were very consciously not listening to the instructions from compliance or the advice from their managers or whatever. Ponzi schemes. So if you look at Bernie Madoff, his wasn't unintentional. He didn't accidentally create a Ponzi scheme for £65 billion. He started really small and he fell down the slippery slope. So the ethical, I think exactly what you're saying, when it becomes intentional versus unintentional, you're sort of bordering into the voice of conscience or the voice of wrongdoing in this case for the ethical traps. And maybe just to give one example, in the book I mentioned Barclays CEO Jess Staley. He caught my attention when I was doing some whistleblowing research at the London School of Economics. And in maybe I think it was 2018 or so, the regulators fined him nearly £1 million pounds, I think it was, for a conflict of interest because he basically hunted down a whistleblower who had complained about a friend on the board. Now, was that intentional or unintentional? It had to be intentional. He didn't accidentally say, go find the whistleblower. So that was intentional. So what I would say would be unintentional was the consequence. I'm thinking he probably didn't think about the consequences. So he, by definition, fell into other traps there after when he did it, not thinking about the consequences. Maybe it's because of ego, maybe it's because his risk calculation, he downgraded in his head the risk of getting caught. He was the CEO, and no one's going to hold me to account. But then, actually, ironically, I don't know if you remember this, but 3 years later, he resigned when regulators found him guilty of his relationship with Epstein. I think he mischaracterized the relationship rather, And he, this was after a 30-year career in JP Morgan when he ran a huge business. But compliance had placed red flags against Epstein, following, the charges. But the problem there is that Staley vouched for Epstein. So what did he hear? Did Staley, because they were friends or professional colleagues or whatever, or they had a professional relationship, he vouched for him, despite compliance saying, here, there are red flags against this guy, despite him knowing the consequences of that in a wealth management environment. So to my mind, I don't think he did know about what was going on, and that's what he says. I mean, I don't know, but that's my assumption. So that's a combination, I think, of intentional deafness, if you like, and unintentional, sort of wrapped up in the one situation. So it can be both. So you can start with unconscious, and then you lead on to some conscious decision making. So you'll find throughout this book that it's not simple, and human behavior isn't. But human behavior typically wants to break everything down into a very simple nugget, or give me the simple answer to hundreds of years of research. It sometimes just isn't that easy.